Welcome in. Thanks so much for joining me. So, I've been thinking about what self-compassion means to me, and often I'm asked to describe it to students and mentees I work with. The other day, it also came up, really predominantly in one of my one-to-one mentoring sessions with someone who was struggling to relate to self-compassion and, how I often teach that. Before I go into describing, my definition of self-compassion and some of the techniques and ways I recommend working with it, I just want to say there's a pretty wide field of what self-compassion could mean. I find the definitions are not always the same. So by no means do I want to say this is the correct one or the right one. It's just what I've found to work well for me in working with my life, and what I've also found to work well for students and mentees I work with on a regular basis. So first off, I think from a Buddhist perspective, as this is often influencing my work heavily with others, is I might question the word self, right? So, for some of you out there who are Buddhist practitioners or study Buddhism, you'll know what I mean by this. For some of you who are kind of newer to the Buddhist world, or you're kind of curious about it, you might wonder why I would say such a thing. And that's because at the kind of essence of the Buddhist teachings is a questioning of when we interact with the world from the perspective of self only, and the idea of self is very reified and strong, that actually this will create more dissatisfaction, more stress, more problems. And that compassion would actually be the opposite of reifying or solidifying around our sense of self or sense of ego. This is not to say that there is not something participating in life that we would usually refer to as self or me or mine. So it's more like maybe in the philosophical department, we might work with this and question it and open it up. But I do think it's useful because when we use the term self-compassion, often there can be this very strong identity of whatever we think self is at this very moment that we're applying compassion to. And that's the first thing I would say. I don't tend to practice compassion that way, and I don't tend to teach it that way, because often I found the most useful way is to approach parts of ourself, or I guess we could say emotions, feelings, sensations, as well as thoughts and different kinds of identities we hold or beliefs, to approach those with compassion. So to clarify it even further, I recommend applying compassion practices to what arises within our internal experience. And I guess we could call that self-compassion, but for me, that's not necessarily self. That's just the content of what arises internally with what I interpret to be self. So a little bit deep end there. But either way, I think you know what I mean. It's sort of like we have the contents of our experience. And usually we experience the contents of our experience, whether that's a perception, a thought, a feeling, an emotion, etc. We experience that as self. And the whole, as I said, the whole idea of the Buddhist path is if we're enhancing self, we're actually moving further away from compassion. So that's the first step. I recommend applying compassion, and I'll define compassion in a moment and sort of what came up in my conversation with my mentee. But I recommend applying it to what's arising, right? And of course, we need some meditation chops for that. By chops, I mean an ability through mindful awareness to just notice what's arising. So you may want to do some preliminary work, just, informal practice and study and, strengthening what I call the awareness muscle a little bit, just so you can be somewhat aware of what's arising in your internal experience throughout the day. The goal is not to catch everything or bear witness or be able to, know everything that's arising, but just some. And then you can start to apply the compassion practices I'm going to talk about. Or it's actually just one practice. So, in particular, this one-to-one mentee of mine who I work with one-to-one in sessions, they were struggling with the frustration of the same kinds of thought patterns or beliefs and or emotions related to that coming up again and again. And they were saying, and you know, I'm working with them, I'm trying to feel them with compassion, open to them, etc. But they just keep happening. And so what I was saying is, well, that's not really genuine compassion, because you want to get rid of it. You want to try to solve the problem, and therefore you're getting frustrated because it's not solving or resolving. And so to, you know, let's start there, but I'll just kind of inform what I just said and take a step back into, this is based on a practice from my main teacher, Sonam Rinpoche, called handshaking practice, and different forms of it, where basically we drop our awareness or knowing quality of mind into hosting and bearing witness to different sensations, emotions, or feelings arising in the body. And then we feel them. But we feel them without trying to reject them, become them, like where we're hooked and kind of off in a story. And especially where we're not trying to solve them necessarily through, you know, analytical thinking or problem solving or any kind of other means. And what happens when we don't do those, I mean, for the most part, we're practicing working with our, you know, suppressing it. We're practicing, you know, basically trying to let go of suppressing. We get hooked and we become the emotion. So we're trying to notice that and just come back to being with. So the result of not solving, suppressing, running away, or becoming is being. And being in and of itself is a compassionate expression of how to be with life. And why is it compassionate? Because compassion is a deep intimacy with the discomfort in our life, the stress in our life. It's an intimacy of willing, you know, it's a willingness or an intimacy of being willing to be with it, because it's a large portion of our day. And in the Buddhist tradition, we would say it's so subtle that it's actually the majority of our day for most of us. But we're often trying to negotiate, navigate, reject our way out of it, distract, right? Because we have the habit to turn away from it. And so compassion in the Buddhist sense is turning towards both that of ourselves and others. But here we're mostly talking about self-compassion. So again, like I said, what are we turning towards? We're turning towards the content of our internal landscape. In this case, our feelings, sensations, emotions. And so when we're doing that, we're going to come up against all kinds of reactions. In the case of this particular mentee, they were coming up against the reaction of, wanting it to be resolved and getting frustrated and building more tension because it wasn't resolving. And I was saying, well, actually, what needs to happen is you need to also accept the emotion or sensation or idea or perspective that you want it to resolve. So when stress or frustration comes in, because we're consistently working with something in our meditation, we also have to include the frustration as a form of pain, as a form of discomfort or dissatisfaction. And we can have compassion towards that. And what does it mean to have compassion? I struggle with this because it's not something we do outwardly as a very strong kind of subject-object experience. It's actually being compassion. That's what we're trying to grow. We're trying to grow our sense of being compassion towards our internal landscape. And then, of course, that can spill over and should spill over into how we work with others in the world around us. So being compassion. And this is kind of interesting because often in the English language, we have to use these words like being compassionate, which I don't know. I'm kind of, it's fine. But I lately have a little bit of an allergy towards it because it's this sense of like what we're being or what we're doing, not the idea that we're just being, right? Or I guess I could say like being compassionate is something we're becoming. It's almost like this other identity we can take on. We're actually just being compassion is more our like how we respond to something whether that's something in our internal landscape, like I said, all the content that can arise in that, or in our relationships in the world around us. So I recommend that, a practice of moving towards, dropping into, learning to be with our internal landscape, and then eventually that will expand into being compassion, which of course will expand into our relationships, relationships in the outer world and with others and our close ones and ones we struggle with and all that. So, so yeah, this is kind of, I think, some of the core issues around when we're trying to practice self-compassion, what it really means, at least an interpretation, and from my perspective, what becomes very a useful way, a very helpful way to look at it. And also, of course, some of the things we can meet, some of the struggles we can meet. I find because it's a practice, because it's a way of being, there's not really a way to perfect it, because we're not trying to get a perfect experience. We're just trying to learn how to be with life and to open to life. I sometimes I'm referring to this lately as we're trying to practice a deep intimacy with life. And so these are all just different ways I define self-compassion, because when it's related to what we think of as self, it's related to all the content that we identify as self, right? And we're trying to relate to that with intimacy, acceptance, openness, feeling, right? Like being with, rather than trying to solve or figure out or push away or distract ourselves from. So, yeah, I'm curious what you all think. If you have some ideas in the comments, I know there's a lot of different perspectives on what self-compassion is, and there's a lot of different entrance ways into it. This is a little more of a, maybe for those who already have a meditation practice, this gateway might be available to you. But nonetheless, I think there's simple practices of even just asking ourselves, hey, what would it be like to be more intimate with the feeling that's arising for me right now, right? And we attempt to do that. Not taking on the strongest, most intense experience we're having, but something that is uncomfortable, but that we're willing to face, we're willing to be with, right? With compassion. So if you want to know more on compassion and self-compassion, I have a lot of content on it in different courses on my website. You can just navigate to the courses tab and check some of that out. You're also welcome to reach out. I have a bunch of free guided meditations on my website. On my YouTube channel, there's a lot of content on my podcast. And, I recommend going to my teacher as well, Sonny Rimshay, for his handshake practice. This is where I'm teaching from, and he's really the originator of this and the master of it. And there's so much beautiful content he has on both his website, YouTube, through his course called Fully Being. And I highly recommend it. So thanks so much. Please comment if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes or somewhere else, feel free to just reach out to me at my website, scotttusa.com. Thanks so much, everyone. Happy self-compassion practice. See ya.